for joining us today on this edition of Business Daily. I'm Ijun, and so let's get started with a look at today's highlights. Following a U.S. trade body's calls for huge tariffs on Korean washing machines, a group of officials, trade experts, and company executives meet to discuss possible countermeasures. With the Bank of Korea's policy meeting due up next week, will the country's central bank end up raising its key interest rate from the current record low of 1.25%? We'll sit down with an expert to talk about this. Let's first get a check on how the markets fared here in Seoul on this Thursday. For that, we connect with our Eunice Kim on the line. Eunice, so the Korean won is still going strong with the exchange rate falling below the 10.90 level today.
Yeah, that's right, June. We saw the $1 exchange rate drop to as low as 10.85 earlier today, and it looks like that is where it wrapped today. As of 3:30 p.m., the local currency was trading at 10.85.41 to the greenback, its strongest in more than 2.5 years, still the best performing currency in Asia. Meanwhile, the main Kospi index in another up and down day was slightly up at 0.02%. The tech-heavy Kosdaq returned to strength, up 1.52% to 792.79. Entertainment as well as other service stocks looks to have led the momentum there. FYI, trading does end at 4:30 this afternoon after a 1-hour delay in opening due to the Sunung College entrance exam. Now, large cap stocks look mixed today. Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix were down minus 1% and 1.96% respectively, while Hyundai Motor and LG Chem were up 1.29 and 1.2% respectively.
So what are market watchers attributing the strengthening won to?
Well, there's, of course, solid fundamentals, an upward growth trend, and Korea's reinforced safety net via currency swap deals with the likes of China and Canada. But there's also global investors' reignited risk appetite. That appetite is opening doors to what's viewed as riskier currencies, such as the Korean won, and the local currency, of course, also needed to invest in shares in Korea, which may look like better deals compared to pricey shares on Wall Street, which had been breaking records of its own in recent months. The bullishness also extending to the Asian region. MSCI's Asia-Pacific Index ex-Japan hit a fresh 10-year peak with a rise of 0.15%. This as the U.S. dollar is weakening, particularly as the November Fed minutes showed a level of dovishness from, quote, many participants. They were concerned inflation may stay below the bank's 2% target for longer than thought. Uncertainty that was echoed by Chair Janet Yellen earlier in the week. This has been Eunice Kim for Business Daily.
And the strong Korean won is undermining the country's export competitiveness, a potential red flag for companies that are heavily dependent on outbound shipments. These include firms like Samsung Electronics, which is riding the wave of a huge semiconductor boom. Experts say while chip demand is expected to remain healthy, lower earning in the won currency when converted from dollars could negatively affect the tech firm's earnings. In order to minimize exchange rate risks, Samsung is now reported to be making most of its transactions in local notes. The automobile industry also stands to lose big as the won continues to appreciate. According to the Korea Development Institute, a 10-won dip in the $1 exchange rate would result in a $386 million sales drop for Korea's auto industry. Earlier this week, a U.S. trade body imposed new tariffs and a quota on Korean washing machines following a complaint by their U.S. rival. In response, a group of experts in Korea's public and private sectors held meetings to gauge the impact and to devise countermeasures. Our Cha Sang-mi has this report.
A group of Korean officials, trade experts, and senior executives of local washing machine producers met on Wednesday to discuss the implications of and possible countermeasures to the suggested global safeguard measures issued by the U.S. International Trade Commission on Korean-made washers and washer parts. At the meeting, Kang Sung-cheon, the Deputy Minister for Trade, said the Korean government would review ways to file a joint complaint with Vietnam to the WTO if the measures come into effect early next year. The government will also reach out to key figures of the U.S. administration to express their stance on the matter and minimize damage to Korean manufacturers. Leaders of Samsung and LG also promised to contact governors and congressmen from Tennessee and South Carolina, where the companies are building factories for final assembly, highlighting that import restrictions would limit American consumer choice and hinder Samsung and LG's job creation efforts in the U.S. The meeting comes after the ITC called for a 50% tariff rate on Korean large residential washers, exceeding an import quota of 1.2 million units at a hearing in Washington on Tuesday. The tariffs will come in a 3-year quota system and will decrease each year from 50% in the first year. The ITC's move comes after American appliance giant Whirlpool made an initial complaint against its Korean rivals Samsung and LG Electronics earlier this year. The panel also placed a tariff on imported washer parts and was split on whether to impose a further 20% tariff on washers imported under the 1.2 million unit quota. The recommendation will be reported to President Trump, who is expected to make his final decision next February. If ratified, it would be the second time for Washington to impose global safeguard limits. Former President George W. Bush imposed temporary tariffs of up to 30% on steel imported from several countries, including Korea, in 2002. Cha Sang-mi, Business Daily.
The Blue House welcomed the president of Uzbekistan this afternoon as the nation's second state guest of the year. After paying a visit to Seoul National Cemetery, an official welcoming ceremony took place at the Blue House for President Shavkat Mirziyoyev. A one-on-one meeting between the two leaders and an expanded summit followed after, where they agreed to upgrade bilateral relations and expand cooperation in various areas. Presidents Moon and Mirziyoyev are now in talks for the possible signing of key agreements and MOUs as we speak. Korea's first couple will host a state dinner honoring the visiting president later this evening. The Uzbek president's state visit to Korea marks the 25th anniversary of the two countries establishing diplomatic relations. Big business deals also being struck, with the Uzbek government signing a multi-billion-dollar construction deal with a consortium made up of Hyundai Engineering and POSCO Daewoo. Uzbek state officials and Korean energy firm executives met this morning here in Seoul and agreed to build a combined cycle power plant in the Uzbek city of Navoy. The deal is worth some $4.5 billion, and the new plant will be capable of generating 450 megawatts of electricity. The construction of a high-voltage transmission line with a length of over 1,200 kilometers is also in the pipeline under the agreement. Top diplomats from Korea and China held talks in Beijing on Wednesday evening, where they discussed preparations for a bilateral summit next month. But with the recent THAAD agreement fresh in their minds, both sides were keen to emphasize their mutual roles in restoring damaged relations. Our Kwon Jang-ho reports.
South Korea and China's foreign ministers met in Beijing on Wednesday, laying the groundwork for President Moon Jae-in's trip to the Chinese capital next month topped the agenda. The two sides agreed that the visit will take place around mid-December with the aim to strengthen and enhance the South Korea-China relationship. That relationship has been tested over the last year after Beijing objected to Seoul's decision to deploy the US THAAD anti-missile system on Korean soil. Despite the two governments reaching an understanding over the issue and announcing their intent to re-normalize relations last month, Beijing's top diplomat Wang Yi began the meeting warning Seoul that they need to uphold their end of the agreement to make sure THAAD does not encroach on China's national security interests.
There's a Chinese saying, promises must be kept, actions must yield results. We hope the South Korean side will continue to appropriately handle this matter.
Seoul's Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa in turn said she considered the agreement a valuable outcome and hoped that it would resolve difficulties for Korean business activities, referring to unofficial economic sanctions Beijing had imposed on Korea in retaliation to THAAD.
We both realize that continued conflict is in neither of our interests, so we have reached this outcome.
Talks also moved on to North Korea. According to Seoul's foreign ministry, Wang reaffirmed Beijing's intent to continue carrying out UN sanctions, but added that they will use their diplomatic efforts to help create the conditions for talks with the regime. Kang said the two nations should work together on that endeavour, while at the same time making sure to suppress North Korea's nuclear activities. At a separate press briefing with the Korean press on Thursday morning, Kang said the two governments reaffirmed their stance to peacefully resolve North Korea's nuclear issue through dialogue and pledged continuing close cooperation on this matter. Kwon Jang-woo, Business Daily.
More than 800 million people across the globe go to bed hungry every night, despite there being enough food to feed all of them. Many hungry people used to live right here in Korea, but that hasn't been the case for decades now. On Wednesday, the World Food Program held an event here in Seoul to call on the world to end hunger once and for all. Our Won Jung-hwan takes us there.
Right now, 1 in every 9 people in the world is going hungry. That's more than the populations of the US, Canada, and European Union combined. But the reality is, there is enough food in the world to feed every man, woman, and child. To discuss ways to tackle this issue and to raise awareness that ending hunger is a task for everyone, the World Food Program held an event Wednesday at the Seoul Museum of History under the theme of Moving Forward with Zero Hunger.
With the World Food Program family, the United Nations, and the people of this great nation, let's partner together to end world hunger, and it starts right here today.
The WFP's Executive Director David Beasley highlighted the history of Korea's involvement in the WFP, which began in 1964. The WFP operated a food program in Korea for 20 years from 1964 to 1984, providing food assistance worth around $100 million through more than 20 projects. But since 1984, not only has Korea ended its dependence on the organization, since 2000, it's been a significant donor, maintaining a strong partnership with the WFP in more than 30 countries. As a country that has transmitted from a recipient of international aid to a generous donor that helps others in need, the world can learn a lot from the Korea's experience over the past several decades. According to the WFP, Korea has so far contributed over $26 million just this year. But the organization wants Korea to do more and inspire other countries as an exemplary case and give back to the world what the world gave to it.
I'm challenging as a Korean government and people to do much more. It's important that Korea should live more prosperously. But just to think about, beyond this territory, there are so many people, still 1.2 billion people going to bed at night with a hungry stomach.
Earlier this month, the WFP welcomed a contribution of $1.5 million from Korea that will provide 2 months of food assistance for some 30,000 vulnerable Syrian refugees in Iraq. These contributions will help give these people food security and better nutrition, promote sustainable agriculture, but most importantly, give them hope that they can overcome hunger as Korea did decades ago. Won Jung-hwan, Business Daily.
The Bank of Korea's November policy meeting is lined up for next Thursday, with market watchers anticipating a possible interest rate hike by the central bank. To tell us more about this, Professor Kim Se-wan from Ewha Women's University joins us in the studio today. Hello, Professor.
Pleasure to be here.
All right, so what are the chances of us seeing the Bank of Korea raising rates this time?
Actually, the market's majority is expecting that the Bank of Korea is increasing interest rate by 0.25% in this month. From early summer of this year, Bank of Korea began to give signals of raising interest rate many times. There are 2 major reasons behind this. The first is U.S. Fed is expected to increase interest rate in December. If they do, the U.S. federal interest rate will be 1.5%, which is 0.25% higher than that of Bank of Korea's. If that happens, there is a possibility of outflow of money from Korean financial market. The second is Korea's economic growth has been improved from 2% increase growth rate to 3% level. So that gave more room for Bank of Korea to increase interest rates.
But as we heard earlier in the newscast, what about the appreciation of the Korean won? I mean, how does this come into play when the BOK considers a rate hike?
In adjusting interest rate, the strong won should be reconsidered seriously by Bank of Korea because it is highly related to export of the nation. As we know, the strong economic growth of Korea has been generated from a great performance of the export. So in these circumstances, if Bank of Korea increased the interest rate, that intensified the value of the Korean won, and that decreased the export of the nation and economic growth together.
Then what about prices? I mean, will subdued inflation possibly put the brakes on the BOK's plan to raise rates?
What we often forget about the fundamental function of central bank it is a fighter against the inflation. They are not responsible for promoting economic growth. Actually, this year's Bank of Korea's inflation target is only 2%, even though actual inflation rate has been decreased down to 1%.
Right.
So in these circumstances, if Bank of Korea increases interest rate, inflation goes down further, which gives a negative impact on economic growth of the nation. For lower inflation, people delay or cancel their purchase of consumption goods and investment goods.
Now, some say that in order to find out what the BOK might have in store for its monetary policy meeting, we need to look to the ECB and its monetary policy meeting. Tell us more about this.
Actually, financial participants found a very interesting result, which is the correlation, the key interest movements of the European central banks and Bank of Korea is quite similar in history. But of course, Bank of Korea refers to European central bank's interest rate decision before they make a decision on interest rate. But this is something accidental, random-based coincidence. Anyways, European Central Bank in the last month decided to decrease money supply by 50%. So Eurozone's interest rate is increasing because they decreased supply of the money.
And of course, many eyes are on the U.S. Federal Reserve, as you mentioned just briefly in the beginning. Now, how will it go about raising rates? I mean, what's your outlook on it?
Actually, the minutes of Federal Open Market Committee, which is the committee for deciding on interest rate and money supply in the United States Federal Reserve, has been released this morning. And according to that, it looks there is a unanimous agreement on raising interest rate in December between committee members.
Okay.
So it is pretty sure that U.S. Fed is increasing interest rate by 0.25% in the middle of December. But there are two issues against raising interest rate. The first is U.S. employment is not actually increasing as expected. And the second is, like Korean inflation, their U.S. inflation rate has been decreased down to 1.4%, pretty low. So that is the two major issues against the raising interest rate of the United States.
So we'll have to keep our eyes on that
exactly.
as well. All right. Now, the biggest concern back here in Korea is mounting household debt. Now, the government has put out some measures to curb borrowing, but I mean, it didn't really prove to be that effective up until now.
Right. So far, Korean government's all the policies on decreasing and minimizing the negative impacts from huge household is not successful yet. And the largest concern related to raising interest rate in Korea is the 1,400 trillion won of household debt, which is as big as GDP of the nation. Actually, recently, because of the expectation of Bank of Korea's raising interest rate, the mortgage interest rate is increasing over 4%, even though Bank of Korea did not actually increase the interest rate.
Right.
So that kind of higher interest rate impacts seriously household economy. Some people say that doesn't matter for households, but between the 0.25% of the interest rate, there are tens of thousands marginal households in that level. So if Bank of Korea decide to increase interest rate, they should be controlling all interest rate increase very slowly.
All right. Well, for now, we'll keep our eyes on what comes out of the monetary policy meeting next week. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you very much.
Korea's biosimilar industry is going from strength to strength after a new cancer-fighting drug developed by a Samsung venture was approved for sale in Europe. The economic value of just one new drug is said to be worth up to tens of trillions of won, and both the government and the private sector are now investing heavily in this industry. Ahead of the so-called bioeconomic era, we take a closer look at Korea's biotech industry and how far it has come.
This is a bioventure company located in Chungcheongbuk-do province. Here, they're conducting clinical trials and research for the development of new drugs. By attaching a small tracker to the drug, this experiment allows a better understanding of how it works in the body. It is an essential step to verify the safety and efficacy of the new drugs.
By attaching a small tracker to a new drug candidate, you can easily see how it gets absorbed into the body, where it's dispersed, how it's metabolized, and how it's released.
Recently, there have been a lot of experiments on new drugs based on biosimilars. Unlike existing drugs based on chemical components, biosimilars are increasingly being used in the global pharmaceutical market as a means to provide customized treatment for each individual.
Nowadays, the people are really aging very rapidly, and economy is really growing now. So people are there in anticipation for better life, good life, healthy life. So their demand for new drug, which is really necessary for them. And biodrug is in the line with the personalized medication. So it's more like a patient-centric therapy. So that's why the biodrug is very important in the upcoming, the industry.
The biotech industry generates economic benefits worth tens of trillion won with one new drug and creates up to 6,100 jobs for every 1 trillion won in revenues. With the global market expected to grow from $1.4 trillion in 2012 to $2.6 trillion by 2022. It's bigger than Korea's 3 major export industries combined, which include semiconductors, automobiles, and chemicals. Korea is becoming a biotech industry powerhouse with Samsung, LG, SK, and other large companies moving into the market. The country's biosimilar market was ranked second among 18 emerging nations in a recent competitiveness study. A development cost of 600 billion Korean won and 15 years of research is required for the development of a single new drug. In order to become globally competitive, backed by stable investment and support, government-led R&D centers have been created, and the Chungcheongbuk-do region is being seen as the foundation for new growth. Chungcheongbuk-do province, which used to be a typical rural area, has been transformed into an unprecedented biohealth cluster through the joint effort of government-led research and private investment, starting off as a free economic zone in 2013.
6 government agencies, including the Food and Drug Administration and the National Institute of Health, are operating in the area. 10 major pharmaceutical companies such as LG Life Sciences, CJ, Daeung Pharmaceuticals, along with over 250 biomedical equipment companies, are concentrated in the area, which also include universities, research support facilities, and private R&D institutes. Osang has developed an optimal industrial infrastructure to enable one-stop services for every stage from research to production, contributing to the development of the biotech industry.
Unfortunately, Korea still has only about a 2% share of the global biotech market. Slow growth is inevitable, as it is being tied down by strict regulations and low amount of investment, far below top-ranked global companies. Recently, the government has been providing active support. This medical equipment research center mainly uses light sources such as visible light, lasers, and LEDs.
여러분들이 내시경 검진 시에 실시간으로 조직 채취 없이 보다 더 정확한 그런 암 검진이 실시간으로 가능하게 될 수 있는 그런 기술이 되겠습니다.
Various support measures and regulatory exemptions are assisting the development and commercialization of high-tech medical devices. The government is subsidizing 50% of the total investment, and in the last 3 years, the center has succeeded in developing 3 new technologies that were transferred to private firms.
We support a variety of incentive policies and ease regulations. It allows a quicker process in commercializing high-tech medical devices.
There is full support at the national level, but I expect there will be better results if more companies and doctors show their interest.
Biotechnology can create new added value by fusing with advanced technology. Based on active government support and excellent infrastructure, Korea could pull itself ahead of the race and become a future leader in the bioeconomy era.
And that brings us to the end. But we'll be back tomorrow with more of the day's top business stories, so don't forget to tune in then. Thanks for watching and see you soon.